So with that, I am so excited to be able to introduce to you our guest tonight. Rebecca DeWolf is a writer and a historian with a PhD in American history. Her research has won recognition through grants and fellowships, including the Dirksen Congressional Research Grant. Her articles have appeared in the Washington Post, Frontiers, and New America Weekly. And with that, Rebecca, I am going to turn it over to you.
All right, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay. All right, so I am so happy to be here tonight to talk with you all about some of the topics in my book, Gendered Citizenship, the Original Conflict over the Equal Rights Amendment. So let me first give you an overview of my book and its contents. My book looks at the competing civic ideologies embedded in the original conflict over the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA. So what does that mean? Well, many books have looked at the ERA during the state ratification battles of the 1970s and early 1980s. My book dives into the struggle over the ERA from the 1920s through the early 1960s. And I identify that period as the original ERA conflict. By utilizing a variety of primary sources, like the often overlooked but still extensive congressional source materials on the ERA and an array of archival collections, my book shows that the conflict wasn't silent, uneventful, or inconsequential before the 1970s. In fact, Congress held several hearings on the ERA during the original conflict, and ERA supporters were able to generate a considerable level of support for the amendment in the late 1930s and 1940s. So my work also shows that the early ERA conflict was not just a fight between different types of feminists, as it's often portrayed in other works. And it was not simply a typical political fight between liberals and conservatives. Indeed, both the pro and anti-ERA positions during the original ERA conflict include feminists as well as people who were not necessarily interested in furthering women's empowerment. And during the original ERA conflict, both the pro and anti-ERA positions include pronounced liberal and conservative variations. As I describe in my book, the original ERA conflict included an array of men and women reformers, intellectuals, labor activists, politicians, legal authorities, lawyers, and government officials. They not only fought over the priorities of the women's movement after suffrage, but they also contested the nature of American citizenship. At the heart of their conflict was a concern over the rights of American citizenship after the 19th Amendment had removed sex as a permissible barrier to the right to vote. In other words, during the original ERA conflict, ERA proponents and opponents were fighting over the role that sex should play in determining a citizen's rights. So tonight I'm going to discuss with you all a few of the topics from the first sections of my book. We're going to look at the radical potential of the 19th Amendment and the effort to draft the ERA. I'll also go over the ways in which the original ERA conflict developed and how it changed over time. Okay, so the story of the ERA begins with the passage of the 19th Amendment because that amendment profoundly altered women's relationship to the state. To start, the 19th Amendment disrupted the traditional understanding of American citizenship that had given men authority over women in law and in custom. Before the 19th Amendment, American political leaders upheld a single standard for full citizenship status, which venerated masculine strength and followed the common law tradition of domestic relations, or the doctrine known as coverture. According to coverture, women did not possess a direct relationship to the state. It also presumed that married women held no civic identity separate from their husband's status. In essence, coverture submerged a woman's civic identity into her husband's status. A dominant belief in early American society was that the majority of women married. So coverture also stood for the legal process by which women moved from dependent daughter to dependent wife. The idea that women were naturally dependent creatures who relied on men for survival permeated early American society so deeply that it was commonly held in law and in custom that women were under the authority and control of the male head of the household, whether it be their father, brother, or husband. While women, specifically white women before the Civil War and then after the Civil War, also Black women, were understood to be citizens and that they were inhabitants of the nation, they were excluded from the concept of rights-bearing citizenship because women were seen to be and capable of maintaining an independent, autonomous relationship to the state. Coverture also signified a system of sex-specific marital duties in which wives were thought to owe their husbands services such as childbearing and homemaking. In return, the legal tradition presumed that husbands provide their wives with shelter and financial support. And treating women as covered by their husbands, coverture imposed several restrictions on married women, which include their inability to hold property, draft wills, control their earnings, to sue and be sued, to vote, hold public office, serve on juries, and enter into contracts. While certain state-level reforms in the mid-19th century did allow women to start holding some property in their own right, there were significant limitations to these reforms, which allowed men to continue to exert authority over women, especially in regard to women's domestic labor and women's rights in the public sphere. As a result, elements of coverture continued to play a determining role in the confinement of women's civic identity well into the early 20th century, which I discuss in length in the first chapter of my book. When American lawmakers finally passed the 19th Amendment, it displaced this earlier societal framework that had given men authority over women. But it also failed to provide a unified set of principles for determining women's rights as citizens after sex had been removed as a valid reason for withholding the right to vote. Because of the destabilizing nature of the 19th Amendment, a period of constitutional uncertainty developed in which political leaders and legal authorities clashed over the constitutional implications of federal women suffrage. An issue in these debates was whether voter status commanded other civic rights. In these debates, political leaders and legal authorities wrestled over the following questions. Did the passage of the 19th Amendment mean that women should be treated as citizens on similar terms with men? If women could now theoretically vote, what other rights did they have? If sex was no longer a valid reason for withholding the right to vote, could it still be a valid reason for withholding other rights? And what were the rights of citizenship after all? Is sex still a legitimate reason for limiting or restricting women's ability to serve on juries, hold public office, and have an independent nationality status? And what about the array of state laws that still favored husbands and fathers over wives and daughters with relation to property, earnings, contracting, inheritance, and guardianship? So these debates played out in several court cases and in the political discourse of the post-19th Amendment era. Most importantly for our discussion tonight, this period of uncertainty prompted several individuals to consider pursuing additional federal legislative measures to clarify women's legal personhood in the post-19th Amendment era. Okay, so Alice Paul of the National Women's Party, NWP, took the lead in this effort. Now, I think most of you are familiar with Alice Paul, but just in case, I'll give a little bit of background. Alice Paul was a vitally important, influential part of the suffrage movement. She created the NWP in 1916 after she became dissatisfied with the leadership of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA. Paul was a brilliant strategist for attracting the attention of the press and the overall public to the suffrage movement. The NWP, for instance, was the first group to pick up the White House for a political cause, and her suffrage parade during President Wilson's inaugural celebration captured the nation's attention by featuring almost 8,000 suffragists. With Paul's guidance, the NWP drew national focus to what had appeared to be the hypocrisy of a nation that championed democracy in World War I while still denying its own women citizens the right to vote. With Alice Paul's leadership, the NWP was able to help push the federal women's suffrage amendment past Congress and the states with full ratification in August 1920. In their rising uncertainty over the constitutional effects of the 19th Amendment, Alice Paul decided to pursue additional measures to clarify women's rights in the wake of federal women's suffrage. In the early months of 1921, Alice Paul had envisioned creating a limited federal bill that would include the theory of equality between men and women while providing a short list of discriminations to be eliminated. These discriminations include giving women an independent nationality status, prohibiting discriminations against women in government service, and removing existing discriminations against women in the Code of the District of Columbia. Alice Paul intended for this bill to act as a model for state-level measures that NWP members would push their state legislatures to adopt. But Alice Paul encountered some problems with this limited federal model bill. As letters between NWP members demonstrate, the leadership of the organization was worried about the best way to phrase the federal bill. As well, NWP members from the South expressed anger about the prospect of more federal legislation that might encroach on states' rights and their state segregation laws. Disillusioned with their original strategy, Alice Paul and her fellow NWP leader, Elsie Hill, turned to the help of a talented young legal scholar, Professor Albert Levitt at the George Washington University. Albert Levitt had already been working on the expansion of women's rights, and he would go on to marry and actually divorce Elsie Hill. Now, regarding the ERA, Alice Paul had already been thinking about pursuing an additional constitutional amendment as the uncertainty over the 19th Amendment's effects were growing. But until her meeting with Albert Levitt, she was still leaning more towards the model federal bill as the best strategy for securing women's rights in the wake of the suffrage movement, or the suffrage amendment. Albert Levitt, though, helped to tip the scale as he encouraged Alice Paul to abandon the federal model bill and go after an additional amendment. The historic meeting between Albert Levitt, Alice Paul, and Elsie Hill occurred on a Sunday afternoon in May 1921. As Elsie Hill recalled in one letter recounting the meeting, quote, "I have never seen more continuous mental effort than those two put into this. During the meeting, Albert Levitt persuaded Alice Paul to pursue an additional amendment by claiming that it could be called, quote, a Women's Bill of Rights." Okay, so this is an early draft of the amendment that I found in the National Women's Party papers housed in the Library of Congress. So Albert Levitt crafted the first, albeit quite tedious, version of the amendment. The first section of the proposed amendment stated the legal rights, duties, powers, privileges, capacities, and opportunities of a citizen of the United States shall not be denied or shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or any state on account of sex. 8 more sections followed that detailed the specific rights that the amendment intended to secure, which include women's right to serve on juries, hold public office, and maintain their own domicile. Towards the end of the meeting, Albert Levitt offered to show the draft of the amendment to his old law school advisor and friend, Roscoe Pound at Harvard University. Levitt dined with Alice Paul and Elsie Hill until about 10 p.m. that night, and then he took a midnight train up to Boston to meet with Roscoe Pound. Elsie Hill and Alice Paul were excited about the amendment and the new strategy for securing women's status as full rights-bearing citizens. Hill exclaimed to a friend in one letter, quote, "It looks as though the amendment will be ready for introduction in 10 days. But the amendment would not be ready for introduction that summer or even that year, as an arduous, almost 3-year drafting process ensued after Albert Levitt, Alice Paul, and other collaborators failed to reach a consensus on the contours of the amendment's intent." The amendment would go through several different versions during the drafting process. Albert Levitt, for example, claimed that he wrote over 75 different drafts, while Alice Paul mentioned in one letter that the amendment went through several hundred drafts. As the amendment went through different versions, it became more streamlined and more focused on upholding the theory of equality between men and women. Roscoe Pound was influential in convincing Alice Paul and Albert Levitt to make the amendment as short as possible and to not go overboard with listing all the rights that they were trying to secure. In his mind, a lengthy amendment would be too cumbersome and harder to get passed. At first, the effort to draft the additional constitutional amendment was quite collaborative. Up until the fall of 1921, Alice Paul actively sought advice and assistance from various activist reformers, lawyers, and legal scholars. Several lawyers within the NWP helped Alice Paul with the writing of the amendment, including Caroline Spencer and Bernita Shelton Matthews. This is just a list of some of the people that helped out in the original collaborative efforts. Not everyone, but it's some of the main players. Roscoe Pound wrote several drafts of the amendment, as well as Shippen Lewis, a lawyer and son of NWP member Dora Lewis. Labor activist and lawyer Frank Walsh also offered support, as well as George Gordon Battelle, a leading Democrat and prominent New York City lawyer. Future presidential advisor Dean Acheson also helped in the very beginning, as well as Florence Kelley. She would go on to become a pretty strong ERA opponent, but in the beginning, she was actually pretty curious about the amendment. During this time, NWP members also met with Ethel Smith at the National Women's Trade Union League and Mary Anderson at the Women's Bureau for their feedback and advice on the phrasing of the amendment. So one of the main priorities at this time was trying to construct a saving clause that would protect the law's ability to treat men and women differently in certain areas, especially in the industrial realm. Roscoe Pound was influential in urging Albert Levitt to back a saving clause in the amendment. A saving clause was needed, Pound and Levitt maintained, because collaborators who were aligned with social reform efforts like Florence Kelly of the NCL and Mary Anderson of the Women's Bureau and Ethel Smith at the National Women's Trade Union League were going to want assurances that the proposed amendment was not going to threaten special labor legislation for women. Special labor legislation for women arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These laws especially regulated women's working conditions by establishing maximum work hours for women, banning women from working at night, and prohibiting women from working in certain occupations, and forbidding women from performing certain tasks during work, like carrying an item over a certain weight limit. Special labor legislation grew out of ideas rooted in coverture in the common law tradition. Specifically, it grew from what some scholars have called the dependent woman theory, or the idea that women are inherently dependent creatures who require special protection and extra special legal treatment. While Kelly, Anderson, and Smith were interested in the idea of a constitutional amendment that would clarify women's rights in the wake of suffrage, especially the rights of women to serve on juries, hold public office, and have an independent nationality status, they were wary of an amendment that might reach too far and encroach on the legal basis for special labor legislation. I'm just going to take a sip of water. So at first, Alice Paul, Elsie Hill, and fellow NWP leaders were on board with including a saving clause in the proposed amendment. In fact, Elsie Hill and Alice Paul expressed their support for special labor legislation in their letters at the beginning of the Equal Rights Campaign. Even before Albert Levitt had pushed Paul to pursue a constitutional amendment, Alice Paul wrote at the federal model bill that, quote, "We, of course, are stating definitively that our federal model bill does not in any way contemplate changing minimum wage laws or hours for women, because as well society is as it is at present, we women need this protection." The original collaborative effort, however, began to fall apart when Alice Paul and other individuals involved in the drafting process were unable to devise a saving clause that satisfied everyone. Future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter played a key role in the breakdown of the original collaborative effort. When Alice Paul decided to pursue a constitutional amendment, she immediately sought Felix Frankfurter's assistance. Frankfurter was an influential legal force and a major backer of special labor legislation for women. He was also a close friend to social reformers like Florence Kelly. But Frankfurter became quite annoyed with Alice Paul and the entire concept of a constitutional amendment that espoused the equality of men and women citizens. In his mind, no saving clause could be drawn up in a way that would effectively safeguard the law's ability to treat women with extra special legal protection. At separate times, Alice Paul and Albert Levitt both traveled to meet with Frankfurter to convince him to help them write the amendment. But Frankfurter refused each time. In Frankfurter's view, laws discriminating against women varied too much from state to state, and a constitutional amendment could not remedy the problem until an extensive investigation into the variations in women's legal status had taken place. From Frankfurter's perspective, a proper investigation would look into which sex-specific labor laws empowered women and which ones disadvantaged women. To him, a blanket amendment declaring men and women's equality would cause chaos and upset the American legal system, which was built around the supposed dependent nature of women. Partly due to Frankfurter's influence, social reformers like Florence Kelly, Mary Anderson, and Ethel Smith began to back away from the amendment. They would eventually start to actively work against the proposed amendment. Alice Paul soon became frustrated with Frankfurter's refusal to back a potential saving clause. So she began to play around with the phrasing of the amendment by herself. By the fall of 1921, she had developed a version of the amendment that she had based on the language of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is the amendment that freed enslaved persons after the Civil War. So it read, "Neither political nor civil disabilities or inequalities on account of sex or marriage shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Paul intended to have this version of the amendment introduced into Congress in the winter of 1921. Paul based this version of the amendment on the language of the 13th Amendment because she considered that marriage under the common law tradition of domestic relations or coverture formed a type of involuntary servitude for women. Most importantly, though, Alice Paul had abandoned the concept of a saving clause because legal advisors Shippen Lewis, Frank Walsh, and George Gordon Patel maintained that a saving clause was unnecessary because the amendment would not affect women's special labor laws in their minds. At this point, Paul was also starting to rethink her support for sex-specific labor laws, but the NWP had not yet come out officially against such legislation. Paul released this earlier version of the amendment to the press in the fall of 1921, which incited a wave of fury from social reformers like Florence Kelley, Ethel Smith, and Mary Anderson. Even though Alice Paul still maintained that her amendment would not undermine sex-specific labor laws, Kelley, Smith, and Anderson believed it was duplicitous of Paul to release a version of the amendment that did not include a saving clause. Many other former allies felt betrayed by Paul's actions. During this time, Dean Acheson and Roscoe Pound came out against the amendment because it did not include a saving clause. Albert Levitt, for his part, was devastated by the turn of events because he too believed that a saving clause must be included in the amendment. In the winter of 1921, he wrote to Alice Paul that he realized she no longer cared for his opinions and that his advice was now, quote, worthless to her. But he continued, quote, at the same time, my interest in the problem you're trying to solve is so genuine and keen that I am moved once more to urge you that a saving clause in your proposed amendment will do no harm and will do considerable good. Even though Alice Paul and Albert Levitt traded a few more heated and quite emotional letters, Alice Paul would not yield to his pleas, and for good reason. As she had guessed, the social reform allies of Frankfurter, including Kelley, Smith, and Anderson, were not going to back the amendment with or without a saving clause. In December 1921, leaders from several women's organizations, including the NCL, the NWTUL, and the League of Women Voters, LWV, met with Alice Paul and told her that they would refuse to back the amendment in any form. They contended that no matter how the amendment was worded, they could not accept its underlying principles because the very concept of constitutional equality for men and women would undermine the law's ability to treat citizens differently on account of sex. As you might have guessed, Alice Paul was quite distressed and dismayed by this outcome of events. In the early winter months of 1922, she decided to put the amendment on hold so that she and her fellow NWP members could gain a better understanding of the legal consequences of their proposed amendment. Okay, so at this time, Alice Paul decided to follow Frankfurter's suggestion from months earlier by launching an extensive investigation into the legal status of women. This massive project was conducted by the Legal Research Department of the NWP under the guidance of Bernita Shelton Matthews, a legal scholar and leading member of the organization. The purpose of the research campaign was to acquire concrete information about the variations in women's legal standing in the post-19th Amendment era. The project lasted for several years and reports were issued throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. In all, the NWP's investigation chronicled the numerous other legal discriminations that continue to restrict women's civic autonomy. The NWP's research especially dissected the common law basis for the legal prejudices against women. I'm just going to take another sip of water before my voice goes. Okay. As the NWP's reports recorded, several states continue to maintain sex-specific policies in regard to inheritance laws, guardianship laws, labor laws, marriage and divorce laws, control over property, jury service, public office holding, docile status, married women's earning rights, and women's economic rights. As the NWP's reports showed, these laws often restricted women's opportunities and independence by favoring the male head of the household and subjecting women to extra legal control and supervision. By the fall of 1922, the leaders of the NWP had armed themselves with concrete documentation showing how sex-based legal distinctions continue to negatively affect women. Thanks to the exhaustive effort, NWP leaders now felt confident in their insistence that absolute constitutional sexual equality was the only way to free women from their legal subjugation. During this time, the NWP issued its Declaration of Principles, which came out fully against sex-based laws and customs, including special labor legislation for women. As the organization's leaders maintained, labor law should be based on the nature of the work and not on the sex of the worker. The organization's Declaration of Principles also reaffirmed the party's support for a constitutional amendment to ensure the equal rights of men and women citizens. After the NWP announced its Declaration of Principles, Alice Paul returned to the proposed sex equality amendment in around the fall of 1922. Okay, With the help of a handful of legal advisors within the NWP, including Caroline Spencer and Bernita Shelton Matthews, Alice Paul eventually wrote a straightforward draft of the proposed amendment. The amendment, now called the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, also the Lucretia Mott Amendment, stated, quote, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States in every place subject to its jurisdiction." The NWP released the language of the ERA at an outdoor pageant in Seneca Falls in the summer of 1923 to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention. This is important. In the 1940s, when the ERA was gaining considerable support, Alice Paul would once again rewrite the amendment to help its prospects in Congress. Due to suggestions from several Congress members, she rephrased the amendment so that it aligned more closely with the language of the 19th Amendment. So the 1943 rephrasing of the amendment is essentially what the amendment now looks like in regards to its primary first clause. Because of those changes, the amendment now reads, quote, "Equality of rights under the law should not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." Okay, but it was during those early years of the 1920s when the NWP was conducting its research program into women's legal status that ERA supporters began to develop a certain form of thought, which I describe as emancipationism. Emancipationists supported the ERA. They believed it was the logical and necessary outcome of the 19th Amendment. In their view, the strength of the American political community relied upon the equal rights of its voting citizens. The term emancipationist captures the pro-ERA position because ERA supporters drew upon the notion of emancipating women from the harms of legalized sex discrimination. In fact, they often used the exact word emancipate or to emancipate when describing the ERA's purpose. For example, Mary Windsor, a prominent member of the NWP since the days of the suffrage campaign, emphasized the need to free women from the restrictions of legalized sex discrimination in her arguments for an additional constitutional amendment. In an article for the NWP's publication, Equal Rights, she declared, quote, "Women in America should emancipate themselves fully at home so as to be ready to play a part in the emancipation of women throughout the world." And amendment supporters' arguments for the ERA, they often point to how the remnants of coverture had sustained women's disadvantaged position. Those restraints on women's civic autonomy, they argued, create not only fluctuating definitions of women's legal personhood, but also constitutional inconsistencies in regard to the rights of American citizens. In the mindsets of ERA proponents, complete constitutional sexual equality was the only way to fully emancipate a class of voters from their legal subjugation. There's the water. Okay, so the release of the finalized draft of the amendment unleashed an upsurge of intense opposition. Roscoe Pound, Felix Frankfurter, Florence Kelley, Dean Acheson, and others came out strongly against the finalized draft. From their perspectives, the amendment posed a dire threat to women's natural right to special protection, as well as to the overall stability of American society. As Dean Acheson put it at one ERA congressional hearing, quote, "The amendment can do nothing useful, but will produce the most terrific confusion, upset all existing rights, and make it impossible for any man or woman to know where he or she stands in regards to rights." As opposition to the ERA mounted, amendment opponents began to craft their own way of thinking about the rights of men and women citizens, which I identify as protectionism. So to put it simply, protectionism espouses the virtues of sex-specific laws and sex-specific rights, and it encompasses the core ideas behind the anti-ERA stance. As one anti-ERA pamphlet from the National Consumers League put it, quote, "Men and women are different in biological structure and social function. State laws regulating working conditions for women, family support, guardianship of children, property and inheritance, marriage and divorce recognize these differences." It's important to note that in my study, protectionism does not refer exclusively to advocates of special labor legislation for women. As the opposition to the ERA grew in the early 1920s, the protectionist position developed to include not only liberal-minded persons who supported labor laws for women, but also conservative-minded persons who didn't like labor laws. Both conservative and liberal ERA opponents believed that women had a natural right to special protection. They just differed in where that protection should come from. So for conservative ERA opponents, women's special protection should come from the male head of the household, while liberal ERA opponents believed that government reform efforts could also serve as an effective tool of protection for women. Even so, both conservative and liberal ERA opponents criticized the ERA as a threat to the sex-based legal distinctions that upheld what they understood to be women's natural right to special protection. A shared desire to reserve the law's ability to treat men and women differently on account of sex after the passage of the 19th Amendment fueled the protectionist position. Alongside this desire, protectionists believe that while the law should respect women as rights-bearing citizens, it should not categorically group women's rights with men's rights. As I describe in my book, protectionists reasoned that actual sexual fairness meant securing two distinct but equally valued sets of rights for men and women citizens. For protectionists, women's distinct rights as citizens include being kept safe in their domestic roles, exempted from military service, and shielded from the ravages of capitalism. From the 1920s through the early 1960s, protectionists and emancipationists fought over the very idea of rights. At the start of the conflict, the protectionist position was quite dominant. Even though Congress held several hearings on the amendment during this time, the amendment failed to make much progress. Up until the early 1930s, most Americans sided with the protectionist view because of an enduring societal attachment to women's traditional domestic duties and the political conservatism of the 1920s. Nonetheless, the supremacy of the protectionist position would not last forever, as ongoing economic troubles and the intense worldwide political turmoil of World War II opened the door to the rise of emancipationism. As I discuss in length in my book, support for the ERA started to grow in the mid to late 1930s because the Depression era increase in the regulation of working women pushed more women's groups to recognize the potential disadvantages of sex-specific labor laws. For many women, such laws hindered their ability to find and maintain gainful employment. The NWP also cultivated the growing discontent with sex-specific labor policies through its Depression-era economic campaign, which especially attacked the escalating discriminations against working women. By 1937, many women's groups that had backed the NWP's economic campaign had become official backers of the ERA. World War II inspired even more support for the ERA because it further destabilized the traditional sexual order. Many sex-based labor laws were suspended during the war with minimum harmful effects, which then called into question the need for such policies. The war also pulled women into the workforce and put them to work in unprecedented ways. For instance, more women were working in what had been traditionally male-dominated industries like shipbuilding. Because of the economic demands of World War II, women were now being asked to build the materials needed to win the war. In all, more people embraced the ERA during the 1940s because the economic needs of the war expanded women's public responsibilities. This new reality gave greater legitimacy to women workers, and it illuminated their value as citizens. But emancipationists could not simply rely on the changing political and socio-economic circumstances to push the pendulum of public opinion in their favor. Rather, they had to actively connect the ERA to the pressing concerns that were preoccupying the attention of the nation's leaders. To this end, emancipationists linked the ERA to the avowed war aims of the United States in their wartime campaign for the ERA. As Alice Paul, the ever-dedicated creator of the movement for the ERA, urged in one article, quote, "At this moment, when the United States is engaged in a war with the avowed purpose of establishing freedom and equality for the whole world, the United States should hasten to set its own house in order by seeking the immediate adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment." In a similar manner, Representative Lewis Ludlow, a major supporter of the ERA, asserted in the same article that if women were, quote, "good enough to render splendid service working in the defense plants of our country, then they are good enough to be entitled to enjoy equal rights with men under the laws of the land." According to emancipationists, passage of the ERA would boost the war effort by showing that the US stood true to its democratic principles. As support for the ERA grew, influential figures and organizations came out publicly to support the amendment. By 1944, 24 national organizations had endorsed the ERA. By this point, the amendment had also gained the backing of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the first Black American women's organization to endorse the amendment. As the number of women's organizations supporting the ERA multiplied, backing for the amendment also grew among public figures and celebrities such as actresses Katharine Hepburn and Helen Hayes, radio broadcaster Dorothy Thompson, as well as authors Pearl Buck and James Truslow Adams. More politicians also came out in support of the amendment. In 1944, 17 Republicans and 8 Democratic governors expressed support for the amendment, and both the Democratic and Republican parties endorsed the ERA in their party platforms in 1944. Okay. As the political parties' platforms' endorsements suggest, the war had cultivated a surge within the emancipationist position so that it grew to include a more pronounced spectrum with regard to its conservative and liberal branches. By the mid-1940s, the ranks of amendment proponents had expanded to include influential conservatives such as Republican political leader George Wharton Pepper and Democratic Representative Howard Smith. For conservative emancipationists, the ERA's inherent threat to special labor legislation fell in line with their support for private enterprise and their criticisms of the government's involvement in the economy. The ERA had also gained the support of prominent liberal figures, such as Vice President Henry Wallace, as well as Senator Claude Pepper of Florida. In contrast to their conservative counterparts, liberal-minded amendment proponents maintained that the ERA would help policymakers expand government initiatives to benefit men and women alike. So emancipationism included conservatives like Democratic Representative Howard Smith and liberals like FDR's second vice president, Henry Wallace. Even with these differences in their approaches, both conservative and liberal emancipationists backed the ERA as a way to ensure that men and women citizens could enjoy the same standard of rights. As I discuss in detail in my book, the wartime changes in the United States helped ERA proponents create a coalition of supporters that transcended conventional societal divisions. By the end of the war, the ranks of ERA supporters had grown to include conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, working class and upper class Americans, as well as white and Black Americans. Most importantly, by the end of the war, both the House and Senate Judiciary Committees had reported the ERA favorably. As the NWP's publication Equal Rights put it, this progress in Congress was a quote unquote splendid climax for the ERA struggle because it now appeared that the ERA stood ready for a vote in both houses of Congress. Despite the amendment's advancement, the strength of the emancipationist position steadily declined in the post-war era. As I detail in the last chapters of my book, protectionists were able to subdue the emancipationist energy by reorganizing their opposition work into a unified group, which revived the anti-ERA campaign. This group was the National Committee to Defeat the Unequal Rights Amendment, NCDURA, which would later evolve into the National Committee on the Status of Women, NCSW. That's the group that spearheaded the effort to create a presidential commission on the status of women. I had to have another sip of water. Hold on one second. Okay, so protectionists were ultimately able to subdue the emancipationist impulse in the post-war era with a series of measures such as the Women's Status Bill, the Hayden Rider, and the President's Commission on the Status of Women. Through these measures, protectionists successfully advanced the contention that their position offered an appropriate but limited level of equality that recognized both men and women as rights-bearing citizens while preserving the law's ability to treat citizens differently on account of sex. All right. The original ERA conflict brings to light several important points about the almost century-long struggle over the ERA and the history of U.S. citizenship. The ERA conflict from the 1920s through the early 1960s was not just a fight between women activists over the priorities of the women's movement in the wake of suffrage. And it was not simply a political fight between liberals and conservatives. Rather, the original ERA conflict supplied the terrain that allowed Americans to reconceptualize the concept of citizenship so that it corresponded to the changes in women's legal status after the passage of the 19th Amendment. During the original ERA conflict, amendment supporters perfected the emancipationist position by showing that a consistently applied single standard of rights for men and women citizens would be an essential step for emancipating women from the sexual inequities embedded in America's social fabric. In contrast, amendment opponents in the original ERA conflict produced a lasting belief in the need to protect a distinct set of rights for women as citizens. The protectionist victory in the original ERA conflict helped to redefine the concept of rights-bearing citizenship from a single gender masculine model to a dual gender model. Despite the generally well-meaning approach of many protectionists, their triumph in the original ERA conflict led to the advancement of a gendered concept of citizenship that justifies a lack of equal treatment for women and the perpetuation of sex discrimination. As I discuss in my book's epilogue, the protectionist notion of limited sexual equality has sustained the restrictions of women's autonomy because it excuses the discriminatory outlook that rights should be dependent on one's sex. But the protectionist victory in the original ERA conflict was not a foregone conclusion. As I noted tonight, and as I detail in my book, The increased support for the ERA during the Depression and World War II shows that when events disrupt the traditional societal order, they do produce a potential for the dominant cultural consensus to align with the ethos of emancipationism. In the end, complete constitutional sexual equality will only be attainable once more people are willing to question the supposed equity of the US's gendered citizenship. And that is where I'm going to leave it for tonight. So let me just stop the sharing here. Okay.
Wow. You just crammed so much information into 40 minutes. I'm not even sure where to begin. My head is spinning a little bit. You went so many different directions with that. I'm so excited to finish reading this book. So we have a few questions, and to everyone, all our participants, please drop those questions in the Q&A. Some of them I feel like you answered a little bit, but we'll just go ahead and bring them up. How would you respond to people who say the ERA went nowhere until the 1970s?
I would say that's not true. I would say read my book. No, I think it's really important to realize that the original conflict before the 1970s was actually quite eventful, and it wasn't just a static issue. So the ERA didn't just sit silently in Congress somewhere until 1970. There was numerous hearings on the amendment, and it gained a lot of traction in the 1940s, and it was up for a vote in both houses of Congress. And members of the NWP really thought that was good to go in the late 1940s. So,
yeah, and there's it was going to pass right at one point, but there was a rider put on it.
Oh yeah, okay, good point. Okay, so the ERA came to the Senate floor in 1946. It got the majority of votes, but not enough for a constitutional amendment. It came back to the Senate floor in 1950 and 1953. I can't remember exact. I think it was 1950. It actually passed the Senate, but it passed with the Hayden rider. And I talk about the Hayden rider quite extensively in chapter 6 because it was a protectionist endeavor to secure a separation of rights. So emancipationists were not going to support the Hayden rider in any shape or form.
Sure. Thank you. So let's see, next question. How did women of color fit into this action? You talked a little bit about them after World War II, but where you talked about, the NAACP support, and I don't know if the NACW was still really vibrant then, or if it had kind of been, subsumed under that bigger umbrella. But were these conversations happening about how do we include all women? Does your book go into that very much?
It doesn't as much as I wish I could have, and it's definitely a subject I want to approach in greater detail in another project. Just to answer your question broadly about the role of race, it's a hard question to answer because, like so many areas in the original ERA conflict, race is also just not a clear-cut dividing line. So what I am meaning by that is that you had Black Americans supporting it and Black Americans opposing it. So you had someone like Mary Church Terrell, the National Association of Colored Women, supporting it by the late 1930s. She even testified in support of the amendment in the 1940s. But then you also had someone like Mary McLeod Bethune. I think people maybe are familiar with her. She was a pretty influential civil rights activist. And she was more of a liberal protectionist and aligned with like Eleanor Roosevelt and the support for the Women's Status Bill. And then also there's racist attitudes and beliefs pervading both the pro and anti-ERA positions. So, and then also just as an aside, there's also support for civil rights, for the civil rights movement, pervading both the anti and pro ERA positions. So just to break that down for a second, on the protectionist side, you have individuals like Florence Kelly testifying at one ERA hearing in the 1920s, saying something to the effect of, if the ERA were to pass, that would mean that Black men and white women would have the same rights. So just really inflammatory arguments. And then you also have on the protectionist side, someone like Esther Peterson and Representative Emanuel Seller. They both hated the ERA, but they support the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation, because in their mind, race discrimination was an unnatural transgression against someone, but sex discrimination could be equitable because in their minds, men and women were so different in their biological and social functions. And then on the emancipationist side, you have individuals like Mary Church Terrell, and also Elmo Lutz of the NWP, seeing the ERA as being a piece of one larger struggle for the equality of all persons. But then you also, on the emancipationist side, have individuals like Representative Howard Smith, who was a segregationist, a white supremacist, and he very much thought that the ERA would be a way to ensure that Black Americans didn't have an advantage over white women. In his mind, his support for the ERA was to secure equal rights for white men and white women. So when it comes to race, like so many areas in the original ERA conflict, you're seeing these blurred lines and overlaps. And it just kind of shows us that even though we might want to put the ERA in a grand narrative of the struggle for equality of all persons, sometimes it falls into that, and then sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it actually obstructs that narrative. So
I think that's such an important point. We get we just had a program on Polly Murray last weekend, and one of my personal heroes. She was not for the ERA, and she was part of that commission on the status of women, with Esther Jackson and Eleanor Roosevelt. And I think you just touched on this a little bit, but I feel like labor feminism is a story that does not, so many stories of women don't get told. Labor stories don't really get told in America, but labor feminism is just like, it's not something people really talk about. And when people talk about, voting women who don't support the ERA or didn't support suffrage, they're voting against their best interests. But a lot of these women were very convinced that the ERA was voting against their best interests because they had just gotten wage floors and hour ceilings.
Yeah, great point. So there have been a couple of academic studies of labor feminism, like Dorothy Sue Cobble. She has some great books out on labor feminists and their opposition to the ERA. So I just will say, though, when it comes to what I call liberal protectionists, which labor feminists are inside of that umbrella, it wasn't just labor laws for them that was making them not want to support the ERA. So when the government started to expand its protective umbrella to include men citizens, like with the New Deal programs and the Fair Labor Standards Act, you're still having individuals like Frances Perkins, the first woman Secretary of Labor, testifying against the ERA in the 1940s. So the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938. She's still out testifying against the ERA in like 1945, I think it was, because in addition to the labor laws, there were other sex-specific policies and customs that they wanted to preserve, because in their minds, women had special roles in the home that men didn't have and that men couldn't do. So they had to have sex-specific laws and sex-specific rights in order to attend to women's special needs. And then that would create equality by lifting women up. It
seems like there are a lot of echoes of that today that were different discourses. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I taught a ERA course at American University over the past weekend, and I was talking with my students about how I think we're in a third ERA conflict right now. So as I understand the history of the ERA, I see the original conflict, like the first conflict from the 20s up into the early 1960s, the second ERA conflict, which I talk about in my epilogue in the 70s and early 1980s, and now the recent state ratifications, a third ERA conflict. But because I'm a historian, it's a little hard for me to like analyze and feel like knowledgeable and things that are happening and unfolding right now. I usually wait for the dust to settle. I definitely still see threads of protectionism and emancipationism on both, like protectionism pervading through the anti-ERA position and emancipationism on the pro-ERA position. But because there is such a broader understanding of gender now, even than there was in the 1970s, that's broadening up the discourse more. And I still don't know how it's happening. I'm watching it, but I haven't come to conclusions yet. So.
Well, thank you for that. Anyway, going back to territory that's maybe more comfortable for the historian in you.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, we have a question about your best primary resources for learning about NWP strategies.
For learning about their strategies? Well, okay, so I'll say, the meat of my primary sources is the congressional hearings. I don't know, I have no idea why, but many historians have not looked at those congressional hearings, and there's so many on the ERA from the 20s up into the early 1960s. And these are lengthy hearings with testimony from a range of individuals. And because one of my main goals was to unpack and dissect the main arguments on both the pro and anti-ERA positions, those congressional testimonies were key. But in terms of the NWP and what's going on in the NWP, the main source materials for that was the NWP's papers at the Library of Congress, and also Alice Paul's papers at Schlesinger Library.
All right, so we have, let's see, here from Bobby Francis, who I think you may know. She introduced your work to me personally.
She's
So
great.
hi,
Yeah.
Bobby. We're glad you're here. Her question is, how do you analyze the effect of the tremendous cultural changes related to sex and gender identity over time on the prospects for the ERA's ratification?
Okay, so Bobby and I actually talked recently, and I think we were thinking about this too with the idea of a third ERA conflict. So I don't know how much time do we have for me to answer this very hard question. So I'll just say one of the reasons I divide the ERA struggle into like these separate conflicts is because of changing notions of gender. And the original ERA conflict, the participants on both sides of the issue didn't separate the concept of gender from the concept of sex. And so when I'm talking about sex, I'm broadly referring to the general anatomical attributes found within the spectrums of male, female, non-binary persons. And when I'm talking about gender, I'm broadly referring to the values and qualities a society may attach to the organization of people into the groupings of men and women. And the original ERA conflict, the participants on both sides of the issue did not separate gender from sex. So even ERA supporters believed that women were inherently different than men in terms of their personalities and behaviors. That's going to change in the mid to late 1960s as an ideological development with regard to how people understood gender took off. So intellectuals and activists started to separate the concept of gender from the concept of sex, such that the stereotypical behavioral traits generally assigned to men and women were seen as socially created concepts and not essential products of nature. And that development is what pushed more and more liberals to abandon the protectionist position in the 1970s and to come over to emancipationism. Now, what we're seeing is even more of a fluidity in terms of gender and an embracing of the fact that many people aren't, falling in the binary trap. Again, though, I'm not sure yet how that's influencing the divides of the conflict. I know that it is, but I haven't come up to a clear analysis in my head of exactly how it's playing out. So I hope that explains it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. That's a really interesting one for me because that's a big area of interest for me. Watching those changing social understandings of what bodies are and mean, and social roles exist relative to bodies.
Yes, absolutely.
Ratify is, I'm sure you're familiar with them. At least
what is it?
Generation Ratify.
Yes,
all the young folks out of Virginia and now the whole country who are fighting for the ERA. And one of their huge things is that when the ERA passes, it's going to protect everyone. It's going to finally give protection to trans people and to people who fall outside of the gender binary. And I'm just hearing echoes of like Phyllis Schlafly and her daughter, whose name is escaping me.
Annie Schlafly Corey. Yeah.
Yeah. She's giving interviews talking about how, just remembering them arguing that if the ERA passed, then the homosexuals could get married. And we just have the same arguments over and over again.
Yeah, but they're taking like a little bit of a different form now with these newer concepts of gender, which is just so interesting. So, yeah.
Well, from your, I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but as like a trained historian, do you see the shifts in our understanding of gender as bigger now? For me, from where I sit as an amateur historian, it seems like one of the biggest transitions in our understanding of like people in relationship to society in American history.
I think it's pretty monumental, and I think it's really important. I mean, what happened in the mid to late 1960s was incredibly important because you have people saying, well, men could also be caregivers and homemakers, and women can also be the main provider. So that was really important for advancing the ERA. But what we're seeing now, as you're saying, with seeing the ERA not just uplifting women, but also all communities of gender, I think is really important because then it shows that somebody's role in society isn't going to be predetermined by whatever their reproductive anatomy may or may not be, that people should be able to function as individuals, which I think is at the heart of the ERA. So
I think that's such a wonderful point and a great place to end for the evening as we are up at 7 o'clock. Just thinking about all the parents and all the, birthing people who don't identify as women, or the people who identify as women who don't have that option for whatever reason. And does it mean to them? What does these conversations mean to them? And as we fight for gender justice and gender equality for all, it's just so important to keep in the forefront of our minds.
Yes.
Didn't get to your question. I'm sorry. AJ, I would love to pop on over to API, alicepaul.org, or any of our emails, and we will tell you inspiring stories about Alice. We have a lot of them. And Rebecca, thank you just so much for being here with us. Everyone who was here, please go buy her book. Read it. It's a great read. Like I said, I haven't finished it yet, but so far it's really compelling. She writes just as well as she speaks. So please go buy her book. And if you liked this program and the other program we do, please consider hopping on over to alicepaul.org and donating to us so we can continue to bring you free programming. And have a fantastic evening and happy Thanksgiving to all of you.
Thank you.